Hello there everyone. Welcome back to Exploring Africa View. We bring you amazing content about Africa. Today we will be talking about the rise and fall of the Portuguese colonies in Africa. We publish new videos every day. Please do well to like and subscribe for more amazing content. Let's get right into it. The Portuguese exploration and colonization of Africa was one of the most important events in history. Prince Henry the Navigator's pursuit of knowledge served as inspiration for the Portuguese explorers who traveled the African coast in the 14th century. The Portuguese took Africans prisoner in 1441 off the coast of what is now Mauritania, initiating the transatlantic slave trade. This was the beginning of an era that lasted for centuries and had a significant impact on Africa. Portuguese commercial colonies, like Elmina in modern-day Ghana, developed into centers of these trades. Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau are just a few of the colonies and outposts that Portugal established over the centuries. These regions became strategically important in the larger European struggle for supremacy, also being valuable for economic exploitation. In the quest for wealth and power, the Portuguese traveled deep into the interior of Africa, where they encountered a variety of African tribes and frequently got into fights to protect their interests. Over time, colonizers drew the boundaries of these colonies and Portuguese control began to influence the course of events on the African continent, affecting the native populations. How did Portugal rise as a colonial power in Africa? How did the long-lasting rules over these centuries came to an end? On this video we will uncover all of the answers and hidden truth. In the 15th century, Portuguese explorers ventured out on daring expeditions around the African coast, motivated by their ambition to navigate unexplored seas and develop profitable trade routes. These discoveries, led by Prince Henry the Navigator, set the groundwork for Portugal's imperial foothold on Africa. Driven by developments in shipbuilding and navigation, the expeditions aimed to discover a sea path to the rich markets of Asia. Portuguese explorers such as Bartolomé Dias and Vasco da Gama progressively revealed the mysteries of the Atlantic Ocean. Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, demonstrating the feasibility of a maritime route to the Indian Ocean. The dangerous overland routes controlled by opposing countries could now be avoided by Portuguese ships, opening up new trading opportunities. In 1482, a fortified trading post named Elmina along the coast of Gold Coast, now modern Ghana, was established. It was one of the most significant events in Portuguese colonial history. Elmina played a major role in the trade of gold, ivory, and slaves. This signaled the start of a network of trading posts strategically positioned to support trade and protect Portuguese interests along the African coast. Not only were these early outposts economically successful, but they were also prepared to face threats from competing European countries. By attempting to dominate maritime trade routes, the Portuguese were able to establish a sphere of influence spanning the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. During the dreadful Atlantic slave trade, in which Portugal was a major player, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported to the Americas. In the middle of the 15th century, the Portuguese were among the first European powers to take part in this destructive trade. Initially, people who were sold into slavery came from places like Senegal and Guinea. Portuguese slave dealers built a vast network during the 16th century, capturing and transferring Africans to satisfy the growing need for labor in the Americas. The cruel exploitation of African men, women and children was made possible by the Portuguese crown's direct support for the regulation of this trade. The well-established routes and carefully placed trading locations allowed the Atlantic slave trade to function as efficiently as possible. Ports under Portuguese rule, like Elmina on the coast of West Africa, developed into major hubs for the trade. The transatlantic slave trade made a lasting impression on Africa. The long-lasting effects of a tragic period in human history are highlighted by the repercussion of this brutal exploitation, which are still felt throughout the continent's social, economic and cultural landscape. Portuguese attempts to colonize more of Africa's interior and beyond its coast increased along with their desire for more trading routes and outposts. The Portuguese pushed farther into Africa because they wanted to dominate the continent's riches and trading routes. The hallmarks of this development were exploration trips and the slow emergence of communities. Portuguese explorers and settlers encountered several difficulties in their pursuit of territorial supremacy, such as physical barriers, strange landscapes, and opposition from native communities. The Portuguese relationship with the many African societies they came across was shaped by this pivotal period in the establishment of colonial power. Portuguese influences spreading into the heart of the continent inevitably resulted in conflicts with pre-existing Africans' kingdom and societies. The native groups and rulers resisted the Portuguese attempts to seize control of the land and resources. These wars featured complex diplomatic tactics in addition to military action. The Portuguese frequently used weapons and other technological advantages to gain upper hands over the native. The Portuguese made significant investment in the construction of colonial infrastructure to maintain authority and enable economic exploitation. This included the construction of forts, trading posts, and transportation networks. Forts functioned as military outposts and hubs for commerce when they were placed strategically along coasts and trade routes. Building infrastructure was not just done for military use, it was also done to lay the groundwork for future economic exploitation. Trades routes grew, plantations were developed, and mining operations were started. Building roads and other transportation infrastructure made it easier for resources and goods to travel throughout the colonies, which aided in the Portuguese government's overall economic consolidation. The growth of colonial infrastructure along with internal colonization and conflicts with Africa governments changed the landscape of Portuguese colonies in Africa. These factors produced a complicated network of resistance, power, and economic interest that set the stage for the continent of Africa's changing colonial history. Portugal made a coordinated efforts to defend and increase its African holdings in the late 19th century, amid the larger framework of the scramble for Africa. Portugal launched diplomatic and military actions to protect its interests because it was afraid of invasion by other European nations. While keeping an eye out for possible new lands, the Portuguese sought to strengthen their grasp on already existing colonies like Angola and Mozambique. But there were obstacles in the way of these attempts. Tension arose due to competing claims and interests, primarily between Britain, Germany, and other European powers. Portugal's resolve to defend its colonial possession prepared the ground for the diplomatic discussion that took place during the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885. Portugal and its African colonies were significantly impacted by the Berlin Conference, which called by European countries to control the colonization and exploitation of Africa. Held under the advocacy of avoiding conflicts among the European nations, the conference aimed to establish guidelines for the acquisition of African territories and their subsequent administration. Portugal had to make concession and yield to diplomatic pressure during the summit. The boundaries of Portugal's possession in Africa were permanently altered by the decision made at the Berlin Conference. The negotiated borders frequently ignored geological, ethnic, and cultural reality, creating fictitious division that endured to this day. As European powers grew closer, territorial disputes developed, and subsequently African countries disputed the established borders. Following the meeting, Portugal encountered difficulties retaining authority over its defined regions. The establishment of the agreed borders was hampered by disputes with nearby colonies and opposition from the native communities. Many African societies organized resistance against foreign dominance during Portuguese colonial control in Africa. These movements were led by courageous individuals who rose to prominence as icons like this of resistance to colonial oppression. Important roles were performed by leaders who opposed Portuguese control, such as Queen Nzinga of Ndungo, Matamba in Angola and Machel in Mozambique. African resistance has taken several forms, ranging from military revolts to diplomatic discussion. Strategically navigating the treacherous landscape of colonial power, leaders resisted cultural absorption and protected their domains. Another notable period of resistance was the Angolan War of Independence, which began in 1961. To oppose Portuguese rule, groups such as the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, The Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola and the National Liberation Front of Angola were formed. These uprisings and revolts showed how resilient African populations might be when faced with colonial oppression. Even though these movements didn't always succeed in gaining independence right away, they contribute to the larger story of resistance and help pave the way for the eventual end of colonial rule in Africa. Portuguese colonial power over Africa started to weaken in the middle of the 20th century as a result of convergence of internal and external causes. Portuguese colonial domination began to decrease as a result of the financial burden of defending overseas territories, local populist resistance, and external forces. Portugal's authoritarian Estado Novo dictatorship saw mounting internal resistance, which changed the country's political climate. The Portuguese military and resources were under pressure during the colonial wars, especially those in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, which hastened the end of Portuguese colonial rule. African colonies saw a surge in independence movements as Portuguese colonial rule broke down. African politicians and activists mobilized for self-determination, inspired by successful campaigns in other parts of the world and influenced by the concept of decolonization. Due to shifting perception, geopolitical factors, and external pressure, the late colonial era in Africa was accompanied by a global decolonization movement. The United Nations and several African countries were instrumental in promoting the abolition of colonial rule. Portugal came under increasing international pressure, with economic penalties and diplomatic isolation becoming more ordinary. Thus, the end of Portuguese colonial control in Africa was brought about by the convergence of internal and foreign pressures during the late colonial period. A pivotal period in the history of the African continent was ushered in by the rise of independence movements, pressure from European power, and the worldwide decolonization movement.